Hi, this is Cecil for Ready Set Do, and today I'm going to be doing a beginner-friendly tutorial on how to make these hand-embroidered patches. Let's get started. Okay, so here is everything you're going to need for your project. First I've got some embroidery thread. This is DMC brand, but any brand is fine. I also have an embroidery needle, and this is size 7, I believe. Anything around 7, 9 should be good for felt. And I also have some fabric scissors. It's pretty good practice to have separate scissors for fabric and paper, but if you only have regular scissors, that's okay too. I also have a fabric pen here. This one has 2 ends. I'm just going to be using this end here, which is water-soluble. So if you can find a water-soluble ink pen, that's great. If not, just use a regular marker, and we'll be careful not to cut out the ink part when we're cutting out our patch. So this is going to be used to trace the shape that you want your patch to be when we cut it out. And to do that, we're going to use some kind of circular object. If you have a compass, you can use that, but it's pretty easy just to find some kind of item in your house that's around the size that you want your patch to be. I also have some tracing paper here. This is going to be used to trace our design, and it can be anything like tissue paper, tracing paper, wax paper, parchment paper, anything like that works. Just make sure that it is translucent, so you should be able to see through it, and you should also be able to tear it pretty easily, so nothing too tough. And then I have my design here. I just drew my design on a sticky note, so you can also draw whatever design you want. You can copy this one, or you can get a drawing online and print it out and trace that. And then the last 2 objects I have are optional. This one is an iron, and this is iron-on adhesive. So this is if you want to make an iron-on backing for your patch, so you won't have to sew it on. And this one is heat and bond iron-on adhesive. You can get it at your local fabric store, and I will show you how that works later. So let's get started. We're going to start by using these 4 items. So we've got the object for tracing, the pen, the felt, and some scissors. So what we're going to do is we're just going to get a section of the felt that we want to use for the patch. I'm going to lay it down here and put the object on top. And we're basically just going to trace around. So like I said earlier, if you don't have a fabric pen, just try to draw lightly, and when we actually cut out the patch, we'll just be careful not to include any of the ink in the part that we're cutting out. So I'm using my fabric pen, and the good thing about this one is that it's water soluble, meaning that whenever I don't want the marks to show up anymore, I can just get it a little wet and it'll go away. So I've traced my circle, and yep, you can see that the circle is showing now, and I'm going to use my scissors to cut it out. So again, if you're using water-soluble pen, then you don't have to worry about the marker still showing, because you can just spray some water on it and it'll disappear. But if you are using a permanent marker or something that's a little harder to erase, you would want to cut a little bit inside the line so it wouldn't show up in your final piece. Okay. All done. And then when you're done cutting it out, feel free to go back and round out the edges a little bit, make sure there's no little bit sticking out, and when it looks pretty even, you're ready to move on. Okay, step 2, we're gonna want our tracing paper or whatever equivalent you have, our design, the patch that we just cut out, and just a regular pen. This one doesn't have to be a fabric pen. And what we're gonna do is, first we're gonna put the translucent paper on top of your design. And you're just gonna go over all of the main lines, whatever you want in your patch, with the pen. So basically what we're doing here is we're giving ourselves a guide of where we want to embroider when we're actually making the patch. So these are the lines that you're gonna see in your final. So when you're choosing your drawing and when you're tracing it, you want to make sure that when you just draw the lines like I'm doing right now, there's enough detail that you can tell what the object is, and make sure that it looks the way you want it to. Okay, and then I'm gonna just do a few dots. This one isn't as important to do exactly the same as the original. Okay, and I think that looks pretty good to me. So now I have the original drawing, and I also have a copy on the tracing paper. And we won't need the original drawing anymore. We're just going to use the tracing paper when we make the patch. We just want to make sure that the drawing is centered on the patch, and also make sure that it fits on there and is kind of framed in a way that you like before we move on. If you don't like the way your design looks once it's actually on the patch, or if you made a mistake, feel free to just try again. Just do another design, grab some more tracing paper, or you can even just use the same one, draw on the corner here. And actually, before we move on here, I'm going to kind of tear this down a little bit, down to size, just because it's a little unwieldy to have this big paper on the smaller patch. So I'm just gonna rip around here, making sure I don't rip any of the actual design. And now this is a little bit easier to hold against the actual patch. Okay, so once we've done that, we're gonna start preparing the needle and thread. So you're gonna get your thread and your needle, and now we want to decide kind of which parts are going to be in which color. So I'm going to start by embroidering this outer circle. So I'm going to get my orange thread. And if you're just starting out, it might be a little bit hard to kind of estimate how much thread you'll need. I know it's definitely still hard for me, even though I've been embroidering for a while. So always go for longer if you're not sure. You can always cut it down if there's too much. You can't really extend it once you've started. So just get a good amount of thread. And for what we're going to be doing, probably try to get like at least, I would say like 3 or 4 times the length of whatever design you're tracing. So I'm going to trace the circle that's around like this long, but I want like 3 or 4 times that. So I'm going to get around this much thread and cut it. And again, if you're not sure, just go longer. Anything from like 1 to 2 feet should be fine to work with. Okay, once we've got that, we want to tie a little knot on the end of this thread. So just a regular knot. It's a little hard to see here. I have a tiny little knot on the end here. And then on the other end, I'm going to thread the needle. So this can be a little bit tricky, especially if you're a beginner. So they do sell needle threaders if you're really having trouble with this. But basically what you want to do is you grab the end like this, and you can wet it a little bit. You can just lick the end of the thread so it sticks together, or get some water. And then you're going to just put the thread through the eye of the needle. And the reason we're using an embroidery needle as opposed to any other needle is embroidery needles tend to have a bit of a longer eye, so it's a little easier to thread the needle. Okay, here we go. So the needle is threaded, so we're just going to pull it a few inches in towards the end of the thread. So now I've got one end threaded, and the other end has a knot. Okay, so we are ready to embroider the patch. So we're gonna put our design on top, if it got removed, and make sure it's centered again. So put it in the spot that you want it to be, choosing a starting point. So I'm just gonna start at the very top here, right where my thumb is, at the intersection of the stem and the actual orange. I'm gonna poke the needle in and make it come out right where that intersection is. And as you can see, I'm actually piercing both the paper and the felt. So I'm going behind the felt, piercing the felt, and then coming out through the paper. So there's my needle, and pulling it through. So it can be a little bit tricky to pull the thread and the needle through, and usually it's because the thread is kind of bunched up behind here, so you want to smooth it out. And maybe give it a few little twists like this, twisting it from side to side, and it should pull right through. Okay, I'm gonna pull it all the way through. Don't tug too hard, but stop when it catches, and since you tied a knot back here, it should catch right at the end. Okay, so we've got a good start. This paper is now kind of anchored to the felt, so this will not move. So now we're gonna start by doing backstitch. So I'm just gonna use backstitch for the entire project since this is a beginner-friendly tutorial. And all we're gonna do first is poke the needle in again a little bit in front of where we just came out. So maybe like just a few millimeters, like 3 or 4 millimeters in front of where you just, where the thread just came out. So let's see, gonna put the needle back and make sure you're not poking your fingers behind. And the needle's coming out here. And I'm gonna go ahead and pull it through like before. And yes, you are embroidering on top of the tracing paper, and that's okay. We're gonna just tear it off later, so don't worry about that. And then once you've put it through the felt again, so now it's coming out on the back side here, we're gonna wanna take it to the front again, but this time it's gonna have to come out a little bit in front of where we just went in. So we're gonna aim the needle to come out a little bit in front like this. And we're pulling it through again. Again, I'm just smoothing out the thread in the back and twisting it from side to side if it doesn't want to come out. You really don't want to tug super hard because that's going to stretch the fabric. Okay, so now it's come out again. And so now you're going to see why this is called the backstitch. So you're actually going to go backwards. And what I mean by that is you're going to poke the needle in where you came out the step before this. So right here, the end of your first stitch, that's where you're going to poke the needle in again. If you see where my needle is sticking here, that's where we're going to go back in. I'm going to twist it a little bit since it's having some trouble going in. Okay, there we go. Okay, so now we have done just about 2 stitches. You can see that the paper is pretty firmly attached to the felt now, and we have 2 stitches along our lines. So we're basically just going to repeat that for the entirety of wherever your line of color ends. So for me, I want to use this orange color right up to the beginning point where I started. So I'm just going to go in a circle like this, doing the same thing. I'm just going to come back up a little bit ahead of where I just went in. So the needle is coming up here. Gonna twist it, it's not coming out. Okay, and then once it's up, I am putting it back where it came out the step before. So right here, putting it back and pulling it out through the back. And make sure that you're not pulling super tight, but you're also not letting fabric, or excuse me, thread just kind of hang out over here. It should be pretty tight. If you look at it from the side, it should be pretty flat. You can see that there's no loop or anything. And check the back too, make sure there's no loops on the back. Looks like this little stuck. There we go. The back is flat, the front is flat, and you're all set. So you're gonna keep repeating that pattern until you're done with that color. And while you're working, just make sure that the fabric and the tracing paper, make sure that neither of those are bunched up in any places. So if you've maybe between a stitch, if the paper is kind of folded or if it's wrinkled, if you make a mistake, go ahead and take your needle out from the thread, so unthread it, and just pull out that stitch, rethread the needle, and just redo any stitches that you want to redo. Okay. So you can make your stitches as close together or as far apart as you want. Mine are just around like 4mm right now, I think. But it really depends on the kind of style you're going for. Just make sure that it's somewhat consistent. That tends to look the neatest. There we go. Okay, so here I've made a little bit of a mistake. This thread came out a little bit too far away from the line, so I'm going to redo that, and I'm just going to do that by pulling my needle out from the thread and then pulling that stitch out, so I'm going to see what this thread is connected to. There we go, and just pull that stitch out. Okay, now it's undone, and I just need to rethread my needle and redo that stitch. And as you get closer to finishing, make sure you kind of zoom out every once in a while. Make sure that your stitches are straight and that they look the way you want them to look. Okay, so I'm at my very last stitch here before I want to finish off this part. So I'm just going to do my last stitch, and then I'll show you how to finish off the thread. Yeah, so we're basically done with the orange outline. And so now I want to tie off the thread in the back. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to find a place to anchor it. So you see how the thread is coming out right here. I'm going to put it under this other stitch that I just did. And pull it through, but not all the way through. And get the tail out like that. Okay. So now you can see that I have a loop here. Feed the needle under that loop I just made and through it. Okay, and then I'm gonna pull it tight, and now I've got a knot there, so I can, I'm now free to just cut the tail end of that yarn. So I'm gonna cut this end, and I'm also gonna cut short the end of that first tail at the beginning here. Okay, so the first color is done, and now you're basically just gonna do the same thing for the other colors. So I'm gonna choose, I'm gonna go ahead and do the green color now. So I'm gonna get out my thread, repeat the same process, get a good length of yarn and cut it, tie a knot on one end, and thread the other end. Okay, it's been threaded, and I'm gonna pull it through just a few inches, and now I'm ready to do the next part. Okay, so it's gonna be basically the same thing. I'm planning to just do the stem, the leaves, or the leaf, and these little lines right here, the folds in green. So I'm choosing to start at the very tip of the stem here. Okay, we're gonna continue on like that until I'm done with the green part. And this part is a little interesting because it's not really a straight line that I'm trying to do. I'm trying to do kind of a star shape. So it's gonna be a little bit different from what we've been doing, but it's essentially the same. I'm just gonna poke it out where I want it to end. And back. And then since I want it to also come out here, here, and here, I'm just gonna do the same thing that I did, always coming back to the same center point. So I'm gonna come out over here, pull through, going back in at that center point, and then just do the same thing with the other points as well, here, here, and here. And just remember to kind of twist your needle back and forth like this when the thread doesn't want to go through. That really helps. And when you're trying to pull out a stitch that you messed up, one helpful way to do it is to use the back of your needle, so the not as pointy end, and just put it under the stitch that you want to pull out, like that. Okay, I'm done with my little star shape here. I'm gonna go for the leaf now. And you can see that the next part that I'm supposed to put my needle through, it's a little bit further away than we were used to. I'm not going directly in a line. It's okay because the back, the thread will connect in the back, but it doesn't really matter since you can't see it. In the front, it will look fine. If you were jumping from like this corner all the way to here, you would probably want to tie off and get a new thread. Okay, so I finished my leaf, and I'm gonna go ahead and tie it off. And just like I did before, I'm just gonna find a nearby stitch and to anchor it to. Slide the needle underneath and pull it through just a little bit until I have a loop. I'm gonna pull the tail out a little bit though, like this. Okay. Once I have that loop, I'm gonna put my needle back under it, inside the loop, and pull through, making sure I keep the loop tight against that stitch. Okay, and then I'm gonna cut off the excess string. And then the last and final thing I wanted to add to my patch is these dots on this orange. And there's a few ways you can do dots with embroidery, but just to keep it super simple for this tutorial, I'm just gonna do it by making very short stitches the way we've been doing so far. So I'm just gonna cut some string, tie a knot, okay, thread the needle, and I'm not really gonna use my guide for this. I'm just gonna put the dots randomly. So I'm gonna pull it through like I've been doing with all my colors, and I'm just gonna put the needle back through very close to where I just pulled it out. So like as close as I can without actually just putting it back where it was. Okay, and then gently pull it out through the back. Oops, I'm gonna pull the string a little tighter because it looks like the knot is not against the fabric. There we go. Okay, pulling the needle out, or trying to. There we go. Okay, and I think the paper ripped, so it's a little hard to see, but I do have a little dot right there. So I'm just gonna keep doing that for all the other dots that I want on my orange. Okay, so I'm on my last stitch here. My paper is looking pretty rough from all the tugging and wrinkling, but that's okay, it's not gonna stay. Okay, so I'm just gonna tie off my very last stitch. As we did before, putting it under another stitch, making a loop, putting your needle under and through that loop, and pulling it tight. There we go. Cutting it short, and cutting the first tail too. Okay, here we go. So we are basically done with the main embroidery part, and now we are left with this paper. So the reason that we wanted to make sure that this paper tears easily is because we're going to tear it now. So just pick a side and gently tear it like this. And we're just making sure that we're not, tugging so hard that we're ripping our stitches out, but we're just removing the paper gently. And this thread is going to be pretty sturdy if you did everything right, so shouldn't have to worry too much. Just gently tugging until all of the paper is removed. And now this piece is pretty loose enough to be tucked out. Got some little tiny pieces stuck here. Okay, so there is what the final embroidery looks like. I'm pretty satisfied. Okay, so once you're done, this is where we can kind of talk about how we're gonna finish this thing off. So once all the paper is off and you've got just your embroidery, there's a few things you can do. You can, if you're happy with the way it looks right now, you can be done. If you're trying to sew this patch onto something, you don't need an iron-on backing, so you would just sew it on in whatever way you prefer. And the process of sewing it on would create a nice frame, so you wouldn't really have to do any work on the edges. If you want to do an iron-on patch, you could just skip to the iron-on part right now, which I'll show in the next step, or optionally you can create a little frame around the edge here. So I'm just gonna do a really simple frame around the edge, since I do have some extra thread. So for the frame, there's a few things you can do, but since again this is a beginner project and we're keeping it super simple, I'm just gonna do a running stitch. So a running stitch is actually even easier than the backstitch that we used for this entire project. Okay, so I'm just gonna pick how far from the edge I want my frame to be. Around there should be good for me. And poke my needle out from that point. And what I'm doing is I want to create kind of a dotted line effect, and that's really what the running stitch is. It's just kind of a dotted line. So or a dashed line really. I'm gonna put the needle back in a little bit in front of my first hole. And then with the backstitch, you would come out again right in front, right? Like right over there. So you're gonna do that again, but unlike the backstitch, you're not going backwards this time. You're gonna keep going forward, so I'll show you what I mean. So far you've gone up and then down, back up, in front, and you're just gonna keep going forward. So I'm putting the needle back a little bit in front, like this. So now I've got 2 stitches here, one in front of the other, and they've got a bit of a gap in between, unlike the backstitch, which does not have a gap. So I'm just gonna keep doing that and go all the way around my design around the edge. Now, quick note, another kind of faster way, a little shortcut you can take for this running stitch, if you're able to, is you can actually kind of thread the needle in and out. So I'm going in here, and then without even pulling the thread through, I'm just gonna pull it back over here, back in, then back out. Do that a few times until your needle runs out of room. And then you can actually just pull the thread through all of those. So this can be pretty hard. I've been struggling a little bit to pull the thread through while I've been doing this project, so I'm not sure how well this is going to work, but if you twist it, there we go. Okay, as you can see, I'm kind of doing like 3 stitches in one, and when I pull it through and stretch the fabric out again, there we go. Looks pretty good. Okay, I'm gonna keep going around and do the rest of the frame. While you're doing the running stitch, just make sure to check every once in a while and make sure that the fabric isn't bunching up too much. You can see that there's a little bit of a ruffle going on here, and you don't really want that, so I'm just gonna lightly stretch it out like this to flatten it out back again. Okay, so I've come upon my last stitch for the frame, and I'm gonna pull it through and tie off, as always, on the back. Okay, tying my last knot, just like I did before, going over or under the last stitch, making a loop, and then going under to tie a knot. Okay, and now I can cut off the tail ends close to the knot. Alright, so this is the finished embroidery. Now the very last step we have left to do, if you want an iron-on patch, is to get your iron-on adhesive. And I'm just gonna cut or tear a little bit off the edge, just enough to cover the size of my patch. And then I'm gonna get my iron. Okay, so I'm gonna set that to low to medium heat. And here's our chance to multitask. While the iron is heating up, I'm going to cut the iron-on adhesive to the same size as the patch. Okay, cutting around the patch, being sure not to cut my actual patch, but just cutting the paper, the iron-on adhesive the same size and shape as my patch. So it's cut to the same shape now, and I'm gonna just lay this down. And my iron is now warm, and holding on to make sure that it's still aligned, I'm just gonna press the iron gently on one side. Okay, so now it's kind of anchored and I can just go ahead and put the iron on the entire patch, just like this. And I'm just gonna hold it with firm pressure for about 10-15 seconds. Okay, and then sometimes it gets a little stuck. Just wait a little bit. It'll fall off. Okay. Yeah, it seems pretty secured. So now this has an iron-on backing. To actually use this, after this cools down, you're just going to want to peel the paper backing off. It's kind of like a sticker, so if you look very closely and try to slide your nail underneath just the paper part, you will see that it kind of separates into the paper part and a sort of clear part that looks a little bit like glue. You see that shiny part right there? That's the adhesive. And again, you'll want to do this after it's cooled down just a little bit, so it's not so liquidy. And then when you pull it off, this is the part that's going to iron on. So when you want to iron it onto something, so if I wanted to attach it to this fabric, for example, I would just put it down and then put my iron on top for like 20 seconds-ish, and it would be pretty permanently affixed. Alright, so here is our finished product. Now, since this is a handmade patch, it might not look perfect, and that's okay. I know mine isn't totally perfect either, but that's kind of the charm of handmade patches. And especially if you're just starting out, don't get discouraged if it doesn't look the way you expected it to. You will get better with time. It just takes a lot of practice. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you'd like to see more of me, please visit my website at cease.space, and you can also visit my shop where I make patches like these at carrothouse.shop. Thank you.